1 second. Okay, so our next presentation is on the evolution of the textbook. And we have Dr. Justin Shorb here, who's going to also introduce himself. And he's ready, and I think you can share your screen, Justin, so take it away.
All right, hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Perfect. And Jennifer, if you wouldn't mind just monitoring the chat just in case anyone asks a question as I'm going through things, that'd be great. I was really glad to hear the success stories so far, and I think that that was a nice segue to my talk because, yeah, I think there is a textbook inside of each of us, and part of what my research has been about in the past has been how to rethink how we see textbooks in general and what their purpose is in our classrooms. So this kind of is an overview of, hey, let's think about from a practical standpoint, where were textbooks at years ago, moving forward, how we use them, and what they can be useful for our students in the classrooms of today and tomorrow. A little background about me. I've been a professor at Gillespie University, a tribal college in South Dakota. I did my graduate school after that at UW-Madison, where I did research on online educational tools, online OER materials, and curating an online digital library in chemistry. Then I followed that up by working at University of the Virgin Islands, an HBCU down in the Caribbean, a small private Christian school in Michigan, Hope College. And I most recently finished up a year-term contract teaching at Duke University, a large private institution in the South. And I, for the past couple of years, have also worked and continue to work with LabFlow, which is a laboratory preparation and report system for chemistry classes, where I get to use a lot of stuff. And I like this company because it does really want to support the OER curriculum as well. So, and we'll get to that later, and I'll show you a little bit about it. Mostly I bring this up to say, I feel like I'm just having a bingo board of different types of schools that I want to go and teach at and get to know the different communities of students and how they interact. And it's been a lot of fun, and I've loved working at all of them. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask me offline later. The picture on the right there is also my office from the Native College Reservation University, and then my office on the Virgin Islands on the bottom there. So back in graduate school, I was very interested in textbooks. I'd gone to a very small school where textbooks really weren't used at all. It was just lecture and then go to some practice problems and then take the test. And the professors, they even gave out their cell phone numbers so you could just call them, that small of a community. So then I got to graduate school, realized there was all these people who came from large schools or other schools where textbooks were used a lot more. And I'm like, well, I don't even know how you use these things. So when I started doing my research in chemistry education research, I was really interested in how you interact with some sort of media in order to understand the field that you're studying. Obviously, there's actual books, there's lecture materials, and I was very interested in just news sites in general, because that's where people go and find information that they're interested about. How do you make textbooks or wherever you're getting your information self-motivating? I see this, I want to learn more about something else. And I was also intrigued because people read books all the time, and there's a lot of stories that go into learning new materials. So how do all these different avenues of learning from media play a role in how students are interacting with our material that we're trying to get them motivated to learn? So to gain understanding from a textbook, you'll find that most textbooks are organized chapters, units, sections, or they have some additional sort of story or narration to it, one consistent author voice. In fact, this isn't probably as big of a deal with this community, but I've had people say before that they just didn't like the idea of having a online textbook that was written by multiple people because it would miss that cohesive voice, which very few students, I think, actually sit down and read from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3 in a row. So slowly that's become less of a thing that people think about, but there is that consistent voice within a textbook. There's also ways that you can get a book to have motivational things, and science, and I think other fields as well, these will have like little call outs to say, hey, this was useful in some pop culture thing in the 30s. Or this is really interesting for some modern day application or some study that people are doing. And then, of course, you have example problems as well, or example situations, prototypical situations, and connections to other materials within the textbook, right? So chapter 7 might reference back to chapter 4, and how do you incorporate that in a meaningful way? So there's a lot more to just a book than a book. And there's actually been a lot of studies out there on how people use books. There's articles from the last 10 years that talk about how and when students should read their textbooks. For instance, there's actually studies that say students should probably read the whole textbook on the first day of class as fast as they can, and then they use the rest of the semester to go over it. There's also studies of how study habits work for students. And the one I really like is in the bottom right-hand corner. This is back in, I think, the 70s, 75. What they actually did was tape a little dot of glue, or actually put a little dot of glue between every single page of the textbook. And every week the students would turn in that textbook and they would count how many glue spots had been broken to see whether or not students even opened any of the pages. And you probably are not too surprised to find that on average, only 3 pages were ever broken on a given week within a chapter, which means the majority of students never opened anything. And so students don't use textbooks. So I think that's one of the things I like to give this talk to say, faculty members tend to be good learners. That's why you got here where you are. And that means you probably opened all of your textbook pages at some point for some of your classes, but your general student is not actually even opening textbooks. So going with this assumption initially that people are using the textbook the way it is not a good assumption to start with. What we need to assume is, what do we have? What was our assumptions that went into thinking that was a good model? And then what can we take from that model to motivate students to use the materials that we're providing them? So my research actually back in 2011 on my graduate thesis was implementing a textbook online for the first time at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So big, huge classes, lots of students. We gave an online textbook to one, used the regular one for the others, and took a look at how people actually used it. These are all self-reported things. Lectures 1 and 2 were assigned the hard copy. Lecture 3 was assigned an online text. And you can tell lecture 3 didn't use the hard copy. Good. So that means they actually didn't use what I told them not to use. Whereas even the ones that were in the other classes, still a decent number of students were saying that they were not using the textbook. And that's just self-reported, which means they're probably being optimistic about how much they're using it. And a lot of schools also say, hey, what would be great is if you would also look at this textbook as well, right? Like, here's the main textbook I'm gonna take your stuff from, but these other ones are really good. So the one below that, how often did you use a textbook other than the one that was assigned? Never, even though there's a list of other textbooks that would have been helpful for those students. So this goes even more into students aren't using those things. Let's see some chats. Is there anything I need to?
You have a citation.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I have, so this is by Monroe, Friedman, and Wilson from Eastern Michigan, and it's in the Journal of Applied Psychology in 75. And I'll post all these slides, or have Jennifer post them all so you can get that list as well. Perfect. So moving on to that, what extent did they use while studying for different portions of the course? This is the same one. Sorry, I got thrown off. I just saw a little red dot. So how much do students use this text? So this is from my course, and I can also provide the citation for this as well. This is my graduate thesis, harder to come by, but we did publish it in a book as well. And ChemPass was the name of our book. So even though we assigned the online textbook, still about 20% of students didn't use any textbook in that class. And some students just really hardcore wanted that hard copy textbook, and some use both of them. Whereas in the hard copy, in the ones that were assigned hard copy only about 25% of the students use the textbook regularly. So actually what's kind of interesting is students are using the online one at a higher rate than they are self-reporting that they're regularly using the hard copy one. Often because we tried to make it so it's portable, and we'll see that. If you want to look at where students use their textbook, so most of them do it at home or in the library, but the other places that people are using it, basically not at all. And there were some pretty interesting results, by the way, of where people are using it. And I do want to remind everybody, this is back in 2011. So this is 10 years out of date. Students are much more comfortable using reading materials on larger phone screens at this point. But this is just kind of giving you the background of where students are coming from when we're talking about this. And also to reflect a little bit on our own experiences, because 2011 might have been while you were in school or still teaching. So along comes LibreText, and I've been working with Delmar and this team. Oh man, I don't know. I don't even want to say though, but almost since then, to be honest. One of the slides he's used many times is looking at the price of college textbooks and how they've gone up. And they've gone up even more than that in recent years. So things are getting very expensive. So we're trying to look at a way to make sure that students not only use something that is cheaper, but make it so that it's better. Because if it's digital, we have the advantageous aspect of being able to make it the way that we want to make it. That's actually pedagogically useful. We probably wouldn't be too surprised to find out that publishing companies tend to make things that sell well, not necessarily things that are informed by best practices. So that means oftentimes they're not abiding by the best principles. And my academic advisor would also say that he didn't get to do a lot of the changes he wanted to his own textbook because the publisher wouldn't allow him. They thought they would lose market share. And now he works with LibreText. And now some other things I wanted to bring up, which is more current research. This is a study that I really liked by Dr. Santiago Sandiurena. And he did some phenomenological studies. Basically, when students are in the laboratory, where do students find that source of truth? So in the moment of learning and using their materials, where do they go to when they have a question? Where is the truth? And they found that there's really 4 different ones that students would say. They either went straight to the manual, opened the textbook, and even if the textbook disagreed with their professor, they went with their textbook because they thought the textbook knew more than their faculty member. Or if they have a very social community, possibly you get students who rely on each other more. I don't know how many people have experienced this when you have a very, very outgoing person in your classroom that can somehow convince everyone to do the wrong thing when you're out of the room for 2 minutes and think that that's the right thing. That's the kind of like, where's that source of truth? Is it the community around you? Is it the TA? So will the TA be the person that somebody will go to over the professor? Or is it going to be the actual professor that's in charge of the classroom that they're gonna listen to over the other materials? And this changed my mind a lot about how we're going to approach things and how you're going to make something systematic and make those things all agree in a very systematic way within your materials for teaching. And actually, as a laboratory professor, I've thought a lot about this and trained my TAs now. At a large institution where I have a team of TAs to do my teaching, I actually refuse to answer any emails myself about content knowledge. I make them go to the TAs because I need them to trust the TA that's in the room with them at the time. For safety reasons, I want that to be the source of truth. And that changes the way that I've designed my online materials as well. Yes, Dr. Google would definitely be a source of truth to many students. So one of the things that when you're designing textbooks, I like to bring up is the idea from a very old hypertext research back when the internet was brand new. And they kind of pioneered the idea that hypertext or online worlds should be thought of as landscapes. So you get these ideas that there's certain landscapes features that are going to navigate you through an online world. You don't have a book, you're not turning the page one after another. And very infrequently online, do you just have a next button that takes you to the next page? You usually have some other navigational tool. So how do you think about that in terms of landscapes that you're giving your students to navigate through? An example I like to give is actually from the Virgin Islands. There is a beach that's Megan's Bay there. And if you wanted to get from downtown over here to that beach, you'd have to go over and around through this area. And right about here, there is a 4-way intersection, and they don't have road names in St. Thomas. So you can't say, take this road to that road and take a right. Instead, they used to tell us when I first got to the island, you just have to go to the top of the hill to the intersection where the tree used to be before Hurricane Marilyn. So they were giving me a landmark based on a tree that didn't exist anymore. But everyone on the island knew where the tree was before Hurricane Marilyn, and then you would take a right turn to get to the beach. So these ideas of landmarks in terms of navigation are very common when we don't have something as systematic which is really where your students are coming from, right? Your students don't know the material, so they don't know that this concept relates to that concept. So you can't assume that they have this knowledge of saying, well, this ties to that. And if I just tell you that it works, instead, give them landmarks conceptually to go back to think about how to reach those things. And you'll see this idea kind of coming to play in a lot of places. For instance, even Moodle has some landmark things that are common throughout the internet. For instance, this little gear icon, everyone here knows that that's where you go for your settings. You probably were never taught that, but slowly, culturally, we've adopted this as the landmark for settings or control panels throughout every website you go to. Same thing with this little 3-bar hamburger icon. That's your menu. It's always been a menu icon. Nobody knows where it started. Well, I'm sure somebody does. I don't. I just know that that's a landmark I use on a page to navigate myself through a material. And then these things here are called breadcrumbs, and most websites have those. So you can understand that architecture that's there based on that. These are all navigational icons or landscape building icons. So the culmination of my research into designing textbooks, I pulled it all together into something that we call the content, architecture, and pedagogy framework. And this is actually on the LibreText designing textbooks area. I can't remember where it's called exactly. Delmar can give a link if we want to, where we walk through some of these things. And what it really does is say, what is the content knowledge? What is the content that you need to study for students to learn? What is the architecture? How are you going to build that so that it helps students to learn? Because you can build any sort of architecture you want to, but if it's not helpful, then it's going to just be another burden to students. And then pedagogy. That can overlap with both content, which many people are familiar with, but it can also overlap with architecture. Can you build an architecture of way that you build things that will reinforce the understandings that you want to get across in your classroom? So I have a lot of things here, but some of the stuff in terms of architecture, in terms of content overlapping with pedagogy, that's a lot of research that's been in your field, right? By maybe a discipline-based research group in your area, talking about how you should relate one concept to another or how to teach a certain concept, pedagogically helpful. And that's all does play a role. But on the other side that we deal with more at LibreText is the architecture overlap. So there's some words about visibly linked connections. How are you going to click on things? My research group has done some studies even on LibreText of when students click a link to go to another page on LibreText. Turns out, if you actually spell out the words, you should click here to go read about this, which is related, they will click on it. If you just say also shown here or something like that, no one will click on it. So it really is more of an engagement in the online world than it is just simply giving people resources. Just giving them a link to something that's related won't necessarily get them to go look at that, but just including your own voice and saying you should go look at this will end up with more students actually clicking that link and possibly going to go view it. Accessibility is a big part, and that's part of the architecture that LibreText has built into it to support that automatically. But then there's also something that you've heard of like scaffolding. In what order do you put things? How do you build things on top of each other? What organizational hierarchy are you going to use? Is it going to be units? Is it going to be textbook sections? And then overlapping architecture with pedagogy. There's a lot of interesting things I mentioned already about the hypertext learning. That's the whole landmark idea. Do you have landmarks in place where students can go back to those areas and understand how things are tying together? But navigation and even cultural crossroads, different societies, different cultures can inform the types of organization that will be important to your field and to your concepts. So knowing how the culture that you're working in. Like I said, I've worked at a lot of different institutions. I would build a textbook for each of those institutions in a different way because of the culture of the students that are at those institutions. And that can play into how you organize things and what sort of large size units you're going to be using, or if you're going to use smaller size units. And that's all very useful. So to give some of those, some context, some bullet points that I've used, content should never be thought of independent from how it is taught or organized. So this is one thing that I think is really important from an instructor that has some experience teaching, is always think not just about listing information, but how are you going to effectively teach that content? And some things about pedagogy, how many different pages you're going to have. So individual pages should have a layout that contributes to that effective learning. How are you going to lay out that page? Are you going to have different units, weeks, or days that have their own effective architecture? Are you going to have a course as a whole that can have its own architecture to lower that cognitive load that students have, or how difficult it is to navigate to different materials in addition to learning that new material? And then, like I said before, a lot of the things that go into the content overlapping with pedagogy would be things specific to your field. So I do happen to have some examples up there and some citations on the Wu and Shaw on the bottom. That's all specific to chemistry education. But then at the top, those different sorts of things with multiple representations, that's chemistry specific, but adding images to text, that's the greatest thing about online, I think, because you can have more digital materials, different multimedia and videos embedded right into it. But you do need to make sure that multimedia is complementary and not redundant. Students experience a lot of more cognitive load if you give them the exact same material in 3 different ways, because they think of their 3 different learning things. So how do you make sure that they complement each other so that you don't overload them? And thinking beyond that textbook as far as potential material that could be linked. So you can also reference to outside sources. You can bring in news articles that would be useful. And that's the nice thing about having an online book, is that you can update those as you go to keep those things relevant. I'm going to skip over that one for a little bit. This whole entire framework is available along with some questions that I put up there. So for content, when you're building your materials, and these are all listed on the site within LibreText. Questions to ask yourself about content. What are your learning objectives? Always start from that. How many are you going to be teaching within a given lecture or in a given exam period? What conceptual links between material are important for your students to understand? In other words, if you're going to try to think about architecture as a way to connect different ideas, then what links should that architecture reinforce? And what depth does a concept need to be covered? This is going to be different for every field, but I know for me, I teach general chemistry, which is a freshman level course. And there's a lot of things that students will go to Google and then find some page that is way beyond the level of this course. So making sure you understand where you're going to cut students off and tell them at what point the material will be assessed. And then how are you going to assess that content? And then how many sample problems are you going to need to provide, either worked out or for them to do. For an architecture, how many learning objectives will you put on a single page? If links are connected, should they be covered at the same time or in different pages with links between them? How integrated do you want your syllabus to be? Do you want to use an online course management system that represents your syllabus? Do you want that to be your syllabus, possibly, and reinforce your course conduct as you go through that website? How do you organize a single page? That's still an architecture question. And should that reflect the larger architecture of your course? And are you including something because it can be included or because it helps learning? As you get new into LibreText and in authoring your first textbook, I can almost guarantee you're going to stick in too much stuff the first time because you're excited about how many things you can do. And it's good to go back later, read through it as a student and be like, okay, what sorts of things were not really contributing to the learning for that this needed to happen, but I just put it in there because I thought it was cool. A certain amount of that I thought it was cool is useful in a textbook, but all of it can't be lost in that. So some examples from LibreText about this. This is one book from Otterbein where they kept a pretty traditional structure of having a single index page with units and then sections, and then some links to outside sources where appropriate, some nesting things to bring things together, and still try to keep things organized in sort of a very traditional format. Whereas there's also this book, this is actually one of Dell's older ones, where the material instead was organized by lecture. So that means there was a tidbit that was going to be covered in the lecture that day, and they wanted to make sure students understood that that was the material for this day, whether they're going to prepare by reading it ahead of time or making sure they had some quiz that was just over those materials. But the textbook itself, you can see, was still mapped out with units and sections, so they could see where things were going, but there are also connected worksheets there. So that tied the assessment to the lecture in a very cohesive way. This past summer, I actually taught a course at Duke where I implemented standards-based grading. So what I did was I tried to redesign my whole course to be based on my standards. So I had 7 standards for my course. And then I told them what days they would be assessed in multiple times about those 7 different standards. I assigned my homework. Oop, that was actually not supposed to be so big. Then I had a section on that agenda page, which was really my syllabus, that said what that standard was, the specific learning goals for that standard, and also would list off what lectures that would be covered in, what readings from the textbook cover that material, and then what assessments would be assessing that material for that one, along with any assumed knowledge that isn't covered in this course, but may be critical to understanding the material that was given in this course. And that way students knew exactly what that standard was. And actually, I even included later on in the semester specific what would be done on those assessments for each time. Then I would use adapt homework system to break all of my homework up either by lecture or by standards. So mine were all given those codes. I had 2 long lectures over the MAT standard and different homeworks. Lectures 3 and 4 were all kind of one big chunk. So I had one homework assessment on there. And then for the midterm, I just had to say which lectures were covered on that homework with that assessment. And then they can see there that that assessment was completely over the MAT and SOL standards. So the assessment there went beyond the individual standards-based assessments, or I called core learning goals, and then gave them that material broken down that way. Another way you can build a class was in, this is an example I pulled from Howard, which had individual hierarchy, big picture view of the class, where there was the agenda for the course, the homework, the lecture slideshows, and then the textbook always seemed to be one cohesive package, right? So this is almost like building one course module, but students can go to the materials by different ways, going through the agenda to the homework, or going through the agenda to the textbook, or going straight to the textbook to look at that. And I believe this course was broken down so that each unit had one assessment at the end of that. So that gives students that idea. Another example, this is from a more modern one by Dalmar, which had the lecture along with a summary of that lecture, and then the readings, the homework, and the worksheets associated with that, and the assumed knowledge. You'll probably see that I stole a lot of this structure in building my Duke course, because Dell has been doing this for many, many years, and this is where his fine tuning has gotten him to. And I agree that that worked out pretty well after many times going through this. So I tried to mimic this as well in my course, but then expanding that to go within that architecture of the 7 core goals of the course. And this is where you can also stick in things like news articles if you wanted to incorporate some other external resources there as well. So then, just as a little caveat, I'm going to show you how this incorporates into LibreText, but also I do work with LabFlow. LabFlow is a big OER school, and if you happen to be a chemist, I just wanted to point out that we do have a bunch of OER labs that are on that list, that URL up above, which are free to use, and they're actually getting ported slowly but surely over to LibreText, so that those are in the online format as well. But even within our company, all of our OER experience are designed basically the exact same way. We take into assignment learning goals, then we break it down by skills, required equipment, and then we use multimedia in a very clear and concise way. And then, of course, if you're in one of the laboratory sciences, you have to think about safety and waste all the time. So then we have these labs that are based off of this exact same architecture, but in a different way. Instead of being a content and media, we can also apply that to a laboratory or in-person experience as well. And for chemistry, this makes it really easy for us to make one lab that can do a bunch of different things. So this way we can publish a bunch of different materials that all have the same architecture, but then have tagged on things in sort of a modular format, because we built it with the architecture of learning in mind when we built it the original way. The figure on the left is actually from a paper about how to design laboratories. So I'm expanding this from just your online experience to your course. But when you have learning, you need to think about your pre-lecture or lab materials, your discussion of those things in class, and then what those things are effective dimensions. So effective dimensions mean enhancing learners' confidence and providing motivations. So these are the 3 levels that were in this paper about building preparatory materials. So the architecture for your class can even expand beyond what they're doing in class to doing more preparatory materials. So they come in prepared and already have some built-on things. One thing I've discovered in teaching using online materials is I frequently just like to use the online textbook as a replacement for my slideshows. If my textbook is really what I want people to interact with, then why wouldn't I interact with it when I'm teaching them the material? So I will frequently scroll through pages of textbook or at least take screenshots from my online textbook to use in my slideshows to reinforce the fact that that really is that source of truth that I want them to go to over and over again. And that can help also with that effective dimension of giving students the confidence to know are they going to be going? Do they feel like they understand the architecture and what's expected of them in the course in terms of finding materials? And here's an example from our online materials here at LabFlow that we use the same way. Tons of videos, tons of lectures, and they all culminate with a pre-lab quiz and the materials after that. So that's pedagogy and practice outside the classroom beyond the textbook. But hopefully that gives you an idea of where we came from in terms of textbooks, moving on to increasing our knowledge of pedagogy in terms of teaching content, but then now architecture in terms of how to organize that to reinforce those learning goals. And then last here, how you can take that and outside the classroom, make sure that your teaching reinforces the use of your textbook, but also enables your students to feel more confident in navigating, understanding where things are located and how they're being assessed. And I can free to take any questions. And I do have some examples here in case anybody wanted to see things like how we broke down that material, our list of experiments, and even my assessments, in case anybody wanted to see anything.
Thanks, Justin. That was fabulous. We have plenty of time for questions, so feel free to unmute yourself. Put it in the chat, totally up to you.
Do you have the videos of the actual experiments in these online resources?
So within LibreText, we don't have all of our videos posted there. Within my company software, LabFlow, yes, we have a whole library of videos to discuss different skills and things like that. And in virtual data, if that needs to be done, to explain kind of like how the company works, just real briefly, all the experiments and protocols and the materials there are all open access and freely available on that website. Download any of them, use whatever you want. And then what our company kind of keeps proprietary is those like pre-lab preparatory materials to get students ready for lab, and then online interactive reports. So it manages the pre-lab preparation, and then the assessment is proprietary, but the materials in terms of doing the lab and doing the experiments, those are all freely available and for anyone in the community to use.
We may want to mention that we are in the process of integrating the OER part of those labs into the LibreText platform for you to be able to manipulate. But as Josh mentioned, there are other components that are not OER that you can capitalize on within his infrastructure.
And I believe by Josh, he meant Justin.
Same thing, right?
Yeah, so it took me a while, but yeah, the labs are slowly moving over. We do have over 300 variations of over 120 experiments in chemistry, so it's not a small process. And then we have a whole new biology laboratory as well. But yes, all these experiments, they have a PDF, and if you ever happen to want to look at ideas, if you do teach general any introduction to organic chemistry, they're all available, and feel free to reach out and talk to me. And then eventually we'll get them all over here so that people can use them within the LibreText interface as well.
There's a question in the chat about the labs being integrated into the textbook.
Once they're in LibreText, then they can be integrated. There's obviously a lot of different pedagogical thoughts about what the purpose of a laboratory is, and whether it is to exemplify lecture materials or be an experience in skill-based growth for students. So some schools keep it integrated with the lecture, some people keep it completely independent, and I've seen it be very successful in both cases. But if that's something that you're interested in trying to integrate those, then I think there is some value in that, especially if you're at a school that requires those courses to be co-graded, which some schools do. And then once you do that, you could integrate it in a more interesting way. I really like to be able to link from my textbook to the lab, because those are example problems that people have seen in person. So that re-emphasizes that real world data is what you're learning. There's a big disconnect in students for the macroscopic view of how things actually work versus the theoretical understanding. For anyone in the chemistry field, I think this is mostly exemplified by taking statistical averages of data to determine how accurate or how precise your data is versus using significant figures to estimate your ability to understand something. Those are the exact same concept taught in completely different ways in different courses, but really they should be brought together in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Justin. Anyone else have any questions? Oh, one just popped up in the chat. Can you please add the link of the lab flow in the chat?
The list of experiments. Oops.
I think probably the website, unless they're looking for do you have this on GitHub, the labs, or are they still distributed in a different way?
Right now, they're basically on this site. The automated one that we had before is not working that great, to be honest. I don't know where my chat is. 1 second, and I'll post that for you.
While you're looking for that, there's a lot of development over the last few years in more technology-enabled laboratory infrastructure, virtual labs and such. Do you have any comment about the utility of that or limitations of that for, well, basically the benefits and detractions off of that?
And I think this applies beyond the laboratory sciences to any sort of real world data manipulation experiences that students have. There's been a lot of work trying to recreate a physical real world experience for students. And the CEO of my company actually did his research for his graduate work in simulations of laboratory type things. And all the research so far really shows that all you teach is students how to engage with a virtual environment. You don't teach them the science or whatever the concept is that you're looking for. So what we've done and what we all have found to be really helpful is try to focus on what is the specific skill that students need to learn how to use. So for instance, if the skill is setting up a piece of equipment, then yes, you should have a virtual situation where they can set that piece of equipment up. But in the case of most times, it's how do you read the data properly? So just as boring as it sounds, having a picture of a balance with the mass displayed and having them type that number in seems mundane. But that's actually the type of experiences that are more valuable to students, because anyone who's ever had anyone use a balance knows, for some weird reason, students read 3 places past the decimal and then record 2 places past the decimal. Why? It's something that just must need to be taught at some point, that you actually write down all the numbers that you see. So those sorts of tiny little skills of recording data the proper way is what a lot of our online virtual labs actually do. We're not a virtual lab company, but we offer like virtual options for all of our experiments. In case a student is sick or something, you can get online randomized virtual data for a student that's actually a picture of a burette and a meniscus. And then how do you read that volume? And it's just a zoomed in picture of that. It's not a large whole entire lab, which makes sense if you think about it, because virtual experiments that keep the user fixated on a large view of the whole entire laboratory room don't really recreate anything about what the student's actually doing in the lab. What they're really doing is it's time to record mass. Look where the number is for the mass. And then they only look there. They're not looking at the whole entire room at the same time. So again, trying to think about where students are in terms of an organizational tool, I think is helpful when you're trying to redo that. So I think replicating how data is taken actually is important. And then helping students to get that formative feedback and doing the calculations is important. Much more important than it is to, where is the hydrochloric acid in this virtual room? Click and drag it to the flask. That's not actually how you do it anyway. And yeah, there are some things that you're going to miss out on, which is that macroscopic, really big view of a room. But that's not how students are taking data. That's not how they're engaging with the data that they need. So focusing on engagement with the data and manipulation of the data has proven to be a lot more useful to our students. And we've got some really cool data at LabFlow of how many times students need to get virtual data over and over again until they can record a volume properly. And it's been really neat. But I can share that with anybody who might want to know later. We have some recorded talks on that. Follow-up questions to that? Anything else?
Can I have a little comment here?
Can you have a what?
A little comment.
Yeah.
Yes, especially what I learned that during the COVID that we went online for experiments. Online can never replace the actual experiment, as you mentioned. It has to be, I mean, in person wet chemistry. But what is very useful is show a video of the experiment and then ask them to do the same experiment, which currently Jove does that, but Jove is not OER. It is quite expensive. Mm-hmm. What I noticed is that when I give the students a Jove video to watch and then do the experiment, they go back again and again to the video to see how this step is done, and they do it much better than they do it otherwise. So probably the OER can fill this gap, have a video of experiments like the Jove does. I don't know how much it takes to develop that, but that would be something useful for students.
Yeah, and I think that's I'm just going to bring up some example. This is not OER, but just to kind of highlight exactly what you were saying. The way that we've been working most recently, where is my 101L summer 2023? In building some really cool stuff, which we probably could replicate in Adapt possibly. We have these preparatory exercises, which are not just videos, but they're actually interactive, randomized data that are visuals. So it's a little bit more than a video. It looks more like, here is a beaker. How would you measure it? At what level would you measure this? What is the level of precision that can use? And having students even just engage with what the data looks like, how you're taking it. And so how students get this feedback as they go through trying to learn to use different pieces of equipment. That's what we've been using for pre-lab through this software. It's specifically, again, like I said before, this is a virtual thing that you would normally just teach in lab. How do you read a beaker? Well, you just read it to 1 places past the decimal. That's a difficult thing to say, but here it says, well, the graduations are in 10s, so you're going to read it in 1s. You always estimate it down to 1 more. So this is kind of exactly what you're saying, Mohammed, where you're trying to get students to do something virtually that can enhance their experience so they can focus on the thing in person that's going to be really necessary to learn in person. These sorts of skills can be learned with a video or like an interactive pre-lab exercise like this. And that's, again, the whole idea of how are you going to align your pedagogy with how you're designing your course and your architecture of your textbook and your experiences for the students.
Thank you. That is exactly what I was asking for, because what I felt is me teaching them is much less effective than giving them a visual resource.
Okay, do we have any more questions? If not, we are ahead of schedule, but we can certainly move on to editing.
Sorry, I'm just so quick, Jennifer.
That's, look, same. Same. Will give me an hour, and after 20 minutes, it's like I'm done already. So
Well, I feel like I threw enough out there that it didn't need to go any longer.
well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us again. And we love this presentation. We will have the slides available. I put this in the chat, but we'll have them in the LibreFest 2023 conductor project as well. And I'm sure that if you all think of something later, that Justin will be happy to answer any questions that come up at a later time. So thanks again, Justin.